Well, actually I want to explain a little bit about where I'm coming from. Is it too loud for you? It's good. I actually started doing research and development in biofuels in 1970. And I don't know if many of you remember 1970, but at that time, gasoline was about 16 cents a gallon. And really, everybody was of the opinion that hydrocarbon energy sources were unlimited, that there was no cap. You could just want it for as long as you wanted, and we would never run out. At that time, I actually was looking at another problem, which was what is humanity doing with its organic waste? Specifically, when you go to a city and you think about the fact that there are maybe 3-5 million people all eating food. And of that food, they might use about 5% of it in their actual body functions, right? The other 95% is waste, interestingly enough. And where does it go? It goes, well, into a system that flushes it, don't see. And then it goes into a huge system where a tremendous amount of energy is used to make it go away. Of course, they don't quite succeed at it all going away. So then the rest of it gets flushed, guess what? And what's interesting is, of course, it causes all kinds of problems, both in the rivers and in the oceans. The problems it causes is algal growth and so on. In other words, a lot of bioorganisms start growing on that stuff. Well, what I, of course, concluded a long time ago was that all the waste that is being flushed and into the sewage treatment systems and so on, extremely valuable nutrients. And those nutrients are actually necessary for a sustainable culture. In other words, all the stuff that is being made to go away from a city and disappear and causes problems and in the oceans, is that we ought to be collecting and putting back on the soil that we're using to grow the crops to feed the city. So, you know, like in 70, I was starting to look at that problem, and what I realized, if we had the right types of systems in urban areas and in villages and towns, we could actually not only create a very high-value fertilizer, but also it would have a byproduct of very amazing energy, which is called methane, biomethane. Methane is, so we could actually be creating the fuel that we need to run the cities from treating the waste in the cities, and the byproduct would be a high-value fertilizer that could grow the crops to feed the cities. And so I was looking at that in 1970, and of course most people thought I was just stark raving mad to even think about it. Now, 40 years later or whatever it is, it's become a reality. All of a sudden people are saying, oh, we do in fact need to recover those nutrients, we do in fact need to recover that energy, and it's a good idea. Of course, gasoline has gone up substantially in price since then. And, you know, finally, we've kind of caught up with ourselves. We've come to realize that our hydrocarbon resources are limited, and in fact, very limited. I don't know what's going on with the speaking system, but I'm just going to launch into my talk. And I'll tell you that from now on, I have just a little over an hour, because we will have Anthony Flavenko coming in. He wants to give a little address to everybody here, so I'm going to make a little room for him at the end of my speech. What I'd like to do is invite people to raise their hand and ask questions as I go. The main reason for that is because it always seems to me as though if you miss something or you don't quite understand something, it's important to get that understanding before we go on with the presentation. So if there's something I say that you don't get, please raise your hand and I'll try and clarify and explain. All right? So basically, the title of my speech really is a kind of tongue-in-cheek. It says, there is too a free lunch. And from what I understand, we're going to have a free lunch here. But what I'm talking about really is the fact that when this piece of rock started out, whatever it was, 4 billion years ago, and it really had just, that's all it was. It was just some molten rock flying through space. And then over several billion years, all of a sudden, it developed over time this amazing wealth of resources. which we call biomass. What all of a sudden happened over time is that you saw the generation of biospecies, first from unicellular to multicellular. The biospecies adapted themselves to the various environments that happened. I mean, back a while ago, the main constituent of the atmosphere was methane. So most of the organisms could survive in that at that time. And then a pollutant started being created called oxygen. And over time, that pollutant became such a problem that a lot of biospecies decided, well, we might as well use it in our process, and became adapted to using oxygen as their main source for their, basically their oxidation process, how they live. And so what's interesting about that is that all on its own, whatever we call it, Gaia, Mother Nature, with amazing creativity and inspiration, created this huge amount of biomass wealth. And when we think about it, actually all the stuff that we're using for fuel and so on, which includes oil, gas, coal, all of those things, are actually stored biomass. And so really what happened over time was that we created vast resources, and we've been mining those and using those for our life processes for a very long time. Now, the reason that I kind of talk about this free lunch thing is because the way that nature had it arranged, everything actually found a way of not only surviving from generation to generation, but actually the species found ways of cooperating and thriving and creating more than they started with. In other words, over time, more and more of this wealth in biospecies in terms of biomass and so on was created over time. And when you think about today's mentality, in today's mentality we think that whenever we use something there's going to be less. And that's an interesting thought when you think about it. Whereas originally, if we really were aware of how nature has done what it's done over the last several billion years, we noticed that it actually was creating more of itself over time, and really the main input being that it was, of course, it was using solar energy, it was using water, and it was using the various nutrients and minerals and so on that were part of the molten rock that it started with. And so over a billion years or several billion years, a huge amount of this stuff was created that we're now living on and that we now use for a lot of what we're doing. And there was never the thought, or there was never the concept that there would be less from one generation to the next until what? Until all of a sudden humans came along and they started doing some things that seemed to somehow create an atmosphere where there was less and less over time. And then if we look at what's happened in agriculture, for instance, over the last probably several decades, where people farm, the soil gets worse over time. And in fact, eventually it becomes desert-like. And we find that we have to put in vast amounts of hydrocarbon-created nutrients, things like nitrogen, and the nitrogen is produced using natural gas and things like that. And so we've gotten into this state of thinking, this way of thinking which says that in order to create, in order to produce, in order to grow anything, we have to put vast amounts of resources into it, and most of them, and many of them being hydrocarbon-based. Well, that's a fallacy. The fact is that if we look back at what nature has been doing, what nature's been doing is it's been creating a cooperative and collaborative atmosphere between all the species in any one area. And all those species are somehow working together to gradually improve the soil quality, the topsoil there, and so on. I mean, if you look at an area that's been left alone for a while, in fact, I was in Colorado about 20 years ago, and the farmers were telling me that they found that if they left a field lying fallow every other year, they got at least as good a result as applying the government-specified amount of fertilizer to the same year. They were growing milo. And that they found that it was cheaper for them just to leave the field fallow every other year. And that's kind of an interesting thought when you think about it, because, in other words, you didn't have to have all that input, and you ended up with at least as much, if not more, biomass and yield as you would have if you had put that nitrogen-based fertilizer in and so on. So that just is one example of how nature, if you let her go and let her do what she does best, actually has ways of creating wealth that is passed down. And it's interesting because one of the things you'll notice in symbiotic systems is that one species waste becomes the food for the next species, becomes the food for the next species, and so on. So you have this cycle where all the molecules are rearranged and passed down from one species to the next, and what you finally end up with in most cases is, if the final waste of it might be topsoil. And topsoil, of course, is then the thing that the next plant matter and the next biospecies use to create more. And so really what I'm talking about in this whole regard is that we actually need to pay attention to what nature has been doing, and we need to incorporate that back into our practices in order for us to get back to a situation where what we're doing not only creates the same amount as what we put into it, or the same amount as what we started with, but over time you actually get more. And so that's really what my whole, you might say, the concept is. And I want to look at a little bit why we have gone in this other direction, which seems to have created this mentality of less and lack. And what I look at is that decisions have been made over time which basically are, in my opinion, relatively stupid. And when I look at what the essence of that stupidity is, I recognize it as something that we all know, and it's called greed. And what I specifically am talking about is that over time, what's happened in the last at least in the last century and a half or so, is that there's been this idea that if one person or one group of people grab more resources for themselves and control more resources than others, that this is somehow going to benefit them in the long run. And of course it doesn't. Because what happens is we create, for instance, this whole mentality of that one farmer should farm 10,000 acres. The only way that he can do that is by using huge tractors, by using chemically based fertilizers, and so on, water-soluble fertilizers, in order what? To have a huge amount of grain that he then sells to, where does it go? It goes to cities. Cities are accumulations of people that actually mostly are there because they, quote unquote, need jobs. They want to work in factories for other people. And what's happened is we've basically created this system where built into it are modalities that actually erode the fertility of the planet and gradually decrease the amount of biomass and of this biospecies wealth that's available to us over time. So kind of what's the solution for that? Well, there are many solutions, and we'll talk about those. One of the things that we definitely need to look at is that we actually start decentralizing everything we're doing. And of course, Grayson Landcare is really on the forefront of that, as is Staengl. What are we talking about? We're talking about creating much more localized food production on a much more small scale and regional basis. We're talking about becoming much more diverse in our food production, not just 5,000 acres of wheat in one spot. We can do small amounts of beans, we can do small amounts of grains, we can do all the other vegetables and so on in smaller areas. Back about 25 years ago, the city of Shanghai could feed itself from within about half a mile of its border, and that includes internally. And how could it do that? There were thousands and thousands and thousands of small-scale farmers. One farmer would have a quarter acre. On that quarter acre, he would grow 9 different crops. He would take those 9 crops, harvest them, and put them on his little cart and shuttle them into the city and sell them there and then come back home. That's a really sustainable system. Within the city itself, they were growing vegetables on every surface that was growable. So, actually, over time, what's happened is we've just kind of gotten disconnected from that mentality of that we can do what we need to for ourselves where we are. We've become much more dependent on someone else providing us everything we need, which includes, of course, our energy needs, our food needs, our water needs, and so on. And that is part of the problem that we are now facing. And the final thing I want to talk about that, and then I'll get into specifics, is that I have, for a long time, been involved in business that is international business, actually. We build systems for Australia and Israel and the Middle East and so on. And in the course of that, of course, I've come very much into contact with Wall Street and with the stock market and with international money trading and so on. And what I've come to realize is that it also is the stupidest system we could have come up with. And why is that? It's because, again, its main motivation is greed. The main motivation that's going on out there is how can one person accumulate the most amount of wealth in the shortest period of time. And that concept, that very idea, that very principle is what then creates the instability and the major problems that we've encountered on the national and global economic basis in the last few years. And I mean, I'm keenly aware of it. Just to give you one nugget to take along from that. I was talking to an investment banker, the biggest investment bank in the world, a bank called Lazard. And I asked him, I said, so this was after the 2008 March meltdown, where the economy had contracted by about 30% already because of the shell games that were being played. And I said to him, have you any idea how contracted this economy can become? Has anybody done any work on that? And he said, oh yeah, we've done a very careful analysis. He said, right now we figure that the real value of all global trade is $75 trillion. The real value. I don't know what they came up with to determine that, but that's what they came up with. And they said, right now it is still trading at $750 trillion. What does that mean? That means that in all the kind of arbitrage and selling from one to the other, that's what they did, for instance, with these derivatives and these bundling, these real estate packages. Everybody is just selling something for a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and finally you've got this balloon that's blown up to about 10 times what its actual worth is. And so when you think about that, so I asked him, I said, so what you're predicting is that this economy might shrink to about 1/10 of what it currently is. And he said, yeah, but they'll never let that happen. I said, well, how can they prevent it? He said, well, they'll just keep printing more money. Which is kind of an interesting, that answer is kind of interesting because when you think about it, I've often wondered, why is there inflation? Well, there is inflation because people are printing more and more money. The amount of resources that it covers hasn't grown at the same rate as the money supply. And so, obviously, every dollar then has to only pays for a smaller portion of what the real value, that real situation is, So I just want to kind of pass these ideas on to you so that you have an idea as to why we need to be looking at other options for our food, for our energy, and so on. And I also wanted to kind of look at what the principle of symbiosis is. And symbiosis is really a collaboration of species where we work together. And just to give you a few ideas about that. If there is a farmer and he has a cow, and the cow is producing 65 pounds of wet manure a day, roughly speaking, it's a dairy cow. And he takes that 65 pounds of wet manure and he puts it into a thing called a methane digester. Out of that, he'll get about 1 cubic foot of gas for every pound of manure he's putting in. That gas has a BTU value of about 1,000 BTUs, and that's a fair amount of heat. He can cook his meals with that. What's left over after that, and what's being used up, by the way, in that process is just the carbon. And the carbon was put in there by the sun. That's how it's, that's through photosynthesis in biomass is how carbon is put in. So it's solar energy that's gone through a couple of stages. Okay, so what we use up is the carbon to create methane gas, which we heat our food with. What's left after that is a fertilizer that is more valuable than the stuff that went in the first case. Why? Because it's now made totally plant available. He can take that and grow the crop that he's feeding to the cow and to himself. So that's one symbiotic principle, just a little system right there. What's involved? What's involved is that there is a cow, she's eating grass, so there's already kind of a symbiotic activity. The grass is growing, the cow gets nutrients from it. Then the cow shit is again a nutrient for other species. In the methane digester are 12 colonies of bacteria, all of them different species. They're all cooperating to take that manure and to take out the carbon and to convert it to methane. All of them are living on the various effluents that one group of bacteria produces. The next group lives on that, it creates another waste that is then passed on to the next. They all break it down, they turn it into gas, and they turn it into fertilizer. That fertilizer goes back on the soil. Guess what happens there? All kinds of biospecies, bacteria, start working with that material to do things like fix nitrogen out of the air. There's a bacteria called Azotobacter. It's a single bacteria. It doesn't even have to, there are various kinds of bacteria that fix nitrogen out of the air. Well, Azotobacter does it all by itself. It can sit out in a field and just take nitrogen out of the air, and the air is 80% nitrogen, roughly speaking, and fix it into the soil so that plants can use it. That's pretty neat. And if you have enough Azotobacter in a field, it can fix enough nitrogen to grow a crop of soybeans, to grow corn, and so on, which is kind of interesting to think about. Now, they're actually a rarely occurring species. However, if you take that bacteria and you put it into a broth, nutrient broth, and then spread it out, you'll have a whole bunch of them doing that, and that's easily doable. You can grow those bacteria. They are being grown in labs all over the place and in petri dishes and so on, and you can make more of them and then spread them out, and you can get nitrogen fixed just by bacteria from the air into the soil. Most people have no idea about that. But this Azotobacter has a few other interesting little characteristics. It will sit on the end of a root hair. It'll find a plant growing, and it'll sit on the end of the root hair, and it will actually secrete root growth hormone. Why does it do that? The root growth hormone has nothing to do with its life cycle. The reason it does it is because it wants that root to go deeper and get bigger, because guess what? That plant is going to get bigger, it'll be more drought resistant, etc. And what does that mean for the bacteria? Well, the bacteria eats carbon. And so eventually, many thousand bacteria generations in the future, that plant is going to fall down, become part of the soil, and there's going to be much more carbon food for the successive Azotobacter generations. So that's just, again, why, kind of what nature does and why we need to pay attention and cooperate with nature on that basis. So I'm going to get back into some of the more specific things that we want to talk about. And anybody have any questions yet? Not yet. Okay. I hope I'm not going too fast or going too far for you. Go ahead.
Do you think, I always wonder about the continual population growth.
Yes.
And whether or not technology can keep pace with an energy utilization, conversion, keep pace with human
Yes.
population growth. And repeat the question.
Okay, so they want me to, yeah. No, they want me to repeat the question because that way it'll get into the, yeah. So the question really is one of can population growth continue unchecked and still technology and or other ways of doing, can there be enough food and enough energy for a growing population? And that's a really good question. Well, I don't know where the limits are in that regard, but I'll give you a few examples of what can happen. There is a place in India called Gujarat, which is a semi-arid area, and what grows on most of Gujarat are these really spiky plants that grow in semi-arid areas. Nobody eats any of it. Maybe camels can eat a little bit of it and so on. And there's really not enough water to do anything. However, in Gujarat, they have monsoons. The rain falls very intensely for about 3 months out of the year, and then the rest of the time it's completely dry. And so a particularly enterprising biologist decided, he went to the government and said, give me 1,000 acres of land of Gujarat. And they said, what do you want that for? And he said, I want to do an experiment. And so he got 1,000 acres of Gujarat, and he started planting other types of arid adapted species of plants. And he got it to become very, very, a whole bunch of different plant matter on it in a very short period of time, which changed the ecology. And then he went in and he started planting in little plants that were slightly less arid adapted and were more productive yet. And what happened, of course, was that every time he got more biomass growing on that piece, it became more able to absorb and retain water, right? And so eventually what happened over a period of about 25 years, he grew a jungle out there on 1,000 acres. And it's really just this square jungle in the middle of arid area. It actually has ponds and streams inside of it. And, people are going like, how in the heck did you do that? Well, he did it by paying attention to how nature can restore its own self over time. And he used that mechanism, but he helped it with his intelligence to do it much more quickly than it would have done if you just left it alone completely. So taking that concept then and applying it to all the areas of even the United States that are currently in arid and semi-arid conditions where there is very little food being able to be produced and very little energy. And if you can start restoring areas like that, and by the way, Gujarat is not the only example of where that's been done. There's another community up in the high desert in Colombia that has done exactly the same thing. They took a huge, vast area of land that was arid, and they have repopulated it. And what's interesting there is that after about 20 years, all of a sudden trees started growing that they hadn't planted. And what they found was that those were the trees that were the original forest species that had grown there. Somehow or other, there had been seeds left in the soil that ended up coming up. What I'm getting to is that we can probably sustain vast populations if we had that approach to agriculture and to creating life-sustainable areas, and that's really what symbiosis is about. It's really, once we learn how to cooperate with all the various species, which include the molds and the bacteria and of course insects and so on, and birds and the larger species, we can create situations that have much more carrying capacity in most areas that we currently regard as unplantable and uninhabitable. So that's my response. All right, any other questions before we go on? So, so the few things that I want to just touch on then, and I'm going from the general to the specific. What I mean there is that I can get into real detail on almost any of these various things that I'm going into. I'm assuming that most of you don't want to go there because, unless you're building an ethanol plant or a methane digester and so on, you really don't need to know. And if you are doing that, we can help you individually to do that, and we're very, very willing and able to do that. I was supposed to bring a whole bunch of handouts for people that are interested in doing that kind of thing, and I lost them somewhere along the way, I'm sorry to say. But I'm going to leave my business card for anybody that wants more information, and they can then track down, for instance, how do you build a farm-scale ethanol plant, how do you build a small methane digester, and so on. We know all those details and can help you do that. So really, again, where we want to go is to try and create as much local self-reliance as possible in every way we can. That's food, that's water, and here we don't have to worry too much about water, but it's something we need to think about, and also energy. And a lot of people say, so can you actually create enough renewable energy to sustain the existing energy usages that we have? And my answer is absolutely yes, but there are several parts to that answer. One is that in many cases, we use energy in completely squanderous ways. We need to just start paying attention to the fact that the energy that we're using, we should only be using as much as is needed in any application, and there are many ways that we could be saving vast amounts of energy. And that includes just very simple things, substantially improving the insulation in our homes, substantially improving how much air is moving through and being exchanged, whether it's being exchanged with a heat exchanger where you can recover the heat of the air that's going out and so on. Those are just very simple things. The other aspect, so conservation is a huge thing. You can build cars with today's technology that get 200 miles to the gallon. Now, you might wonder why people aren't doing that. I really have no idea other than that we're still finding our way out of the greed cycle and beginning to realize that energy is a limited commodity that we actually need to start saving. But, people say, well, how can you build a car that gets 200 miles to the gallon? It's been done. There's an institute called the Rocky Mountain Solar Institute. They built a car using carbon fiber as the body to create the body of it. They used basically resins and carbon fibers to build a very light body. And then they put a very small engine in it because, of course, the reason you have a big engine in most cars is because it's made out of steel and weighs 4,000 or 5,000 pounds. And this car weighed much, much less than that. But it could still carry 4 or 6 passengers. And it was designed in such a way that it was completely aerodynamic. And when they tested it on the road, it got somewhere between 150 and 200 miles to the gallon, 200 miles on the highway and 150 on, in shorter runs. And what's interesting is they made that, all the technology for that vehicle is made available basically they didn't patent it. They left it in public access, public domain, because they want the major car manufacturers to shift to that kind of system, but they haven't been taken up on it by anybody yet, because the whole system is still going the way that it always has. It's very difficult to turn a big vehicle around like that. So we have to conserve. That's one part. The other part of it is that there is a huge amount of energy available to us everywhere we are. And that's, of course, in the form of solar energy. Most people think about solar energy as just the sun that shines down. And that, of course, is where it mostly comes from. Just some simple facts are that the amount of energy that falls on the surface of the Earth from the sun in 1 hour is the equivalent of 8,000 times the amount of energy we use on the entire planet in a year. All right? Now that number is almost unfathomable. However, it's a fact, and of course the facts are that we can only collect a very, very small portion of that, because most of it is on ocean, most of it is on, on mountain peaks and in areas where we just aren't. But that's, when you think about it, that means that we can, if we harvest only 1/100th of 1% of that energy, we still have more than enough to carry on all our various energy-using functions, including for a growing population over time. Now, solar energy comes in many forms, though. You have to realize that when we look at, for instance, falling water, and we have a water wheel or a water turbine or even the big hydro dams that we have, that's solar energy. Why is that? Because the water that is falling is water that was evaporated by the sun, and then it recondenses, and it falls back down. And that's, so the sun actually makes that energy work. The sun is also what is responsible for all the energy that's currently being mined as coal and or as oil. Again, what happens is the sun creates the carbon in the biomass, the carbon is sequestered in biomass, and then it's, in the case of oil and in the case of coal, it's been underground for a very long time, and it gets squeezed and pressed until it's in the form that it is, that we then use it again. So solar energy is actually responsible for and can be utilized to run the entire world energy economy on an ongoing basis. Now, a lot of people think that that's an impossible goal. It's impossible to get there. How do we convert all of the things that we need to convert in order to use solar energy? Well, firstly, if we look at, for instance, vehicles, most of them use some kind of liquid or gaseous fuel. Well, the fact is that we can make any one of those fuels out of biomass. Any fuel that is being made by hydrocarbons, whether it's Jet A, whether it's diesel fuel, whether it's natural gas, whether it is gasoline, can be made from biomass. And it can be made in various ways. I mean, ethanol, for instance, which most of you have heard about, is just one type of liquid fuel that can be made from biomass. There are also a variety of liquid fuels that are just like gasoline that can be made from biomass. In fact, the same thing can be said for diesel, and the same thing, there's biodiesel, but there are also diesels that are almost identical to the hydrocarbon diesel that can be made from biomass. You can make any type of alcohol, any type of gas. All of that can be made out of corn stover, it can be made out of wood chips, it can be made out of peanut hulls, and we've done that. So, I'm not talking about something that I don't know can be done. It all can be done. And the question is, how much would it take for us to go from what we're currently doing, which is mining it out of the ground and then refining it and then putting it in our vehicles and so on, to actually having local ethanol and biodiesel and other types of fueling stations that actually rely on the local area for their input? How much effort would that take? Well, there were two teams that studied that, one from MIT and one from Stanford. And what they said was that it could be done in 10 years. That's the first thing that was interesting. Not only that, they said it could be 10 years using, listen to this carefully, using the amount of energy, effort, resources, and technology that we use for one major car manufacturer to switch model years. All right? That's an interesting point. In other words, if GM decided to just produce the same models next year and take all the technology and effort that they put into to create the new models for the following year and just apply all that effort towards creating wind generators, solar collectors, more efficient vehicles, you know, all the things that we were talking about, the whole economy could be shifted to renewables in 10 years. And it's interesting because I actually got kind of busy in this arena in 1980, which was when Jimmy Carter was elected. And he at that time had a program which was going to do that. He had a program where he was going to shift all the US, it was just for the United States, energy economy from hydrocarbon-based to renewable-based. He wanted, actually his objective was to be totally independent of foreign crude in 10 years. And he had a very, very good program, a very step-by-step, you know, program to do that. And of course, what happened was two things. There were a lot of people in the energy business that absolutely didn't want to see that happen. And I don't know if you remember, but in 1988-89, the price of crude came plummeting down from, it had reached a high of about $45 a barrel, and it came plummeting down to $11 a barrel. How did that happen? Well, it was very simple. The Saudis were the key producers, swing producers, and they still are, in the world. And while the shortage had been happening during Carter's reign, you know, you had 20% inflation, you had spiking fuel prices and all that stuff. And then when the Republicans, when Reagan was elected and so on, signals were made to, yes, we're going to cooperate with you, we're going to sell you F-16s, we're going to do anything you want to the Saudis. And the Saudis doubled their fuel production. They doubled. They went from 7 million barrels a day of gasoline production to 14 million of crude, actually, and then it got converted. They doubled, and within about 3 to 4 months, you started seeing the price of gasoline crash. Now, why did that have the effect that it did, which was to actually gut the entire renewable fuels program? The reason was because, again, Wall Street and all the investors that invest in industry and in businesses that are trying to make these changes to work towards, all of a sudden said, wait a minute, that's not a good business anymore. And they pulled their resources. I was actually at a point where I was trying to commercialize a technology which was taking wood chips and converting those wood chips into ethanol and into a variety of very, very valuable products. And all of that could be made from wood chips, just from simple wood chips. And we were very close to commercialization. When the price of crude came crashing down, everybody ran in the other direction. Nobody wanted to fund it because they said, no, 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 hydrocarbons are actually totally available, they're very cheap, we don't have to worry about renewables anymore. So that was what happened on a worldwide basis. I mean, and then, of course, what happened over time is then we got back into raising the price again, and all of a sudden it starts looking like a good idea. And now, of course, at least alcohol and biodiesel have become almost household words, and I don't know if you've noticed, but almost every pump in the nation now has around 10% ethanol in it. And that's a good thing. Now, the only problem with that, of course, is that it's being created, what, by chemically grown corn, and that's not sustainable in the long run, but it doesn't have to be. Ethanol can be made from any biomass waste anywhere. The technology is available now. It's not a matter of it not being available. It's just that the corn boys have a lot of lobbying power too. And so they've kept the whole focus in this country on corn-derived and soy-derived products. That's why biodiesel is mostly made out of soy oil, and that's why ethanol is mostly made out of corn. It doesn't have to be. All of those things could be changed over time. And eventually they will be. The idea is, you know, just think with me about this. If we had a little what I call a biorefinery about every 20 miles across the country, and that biorefinery took in a variety of crops from the farmers in that region, and then converted those crops into high-value food products, into high-value energy products, into things like epoxies, into things like even carbon fibers. We made from the same stuff, we made some tiles that were heat resistant enough to withstand the shuttle re-entering into the atmosphere. and that was made all from biomass. It was carbon fibers and cellulose matrices and things like that. So what I'm trying to tell you is this. That stuff that we grow and that stuff that grows around us all the time can produce anything we want it to, and we don't have to rely on a hydrocarbon economy. I'm going to wrap this up a little bit and just drop for questions from anybody here. I know that I only have another 5 or so minutes, right? What is that? 30. Oh, we have 30 minutes. Oh, sorry. That's great. then I can go on for a long time. I mean, I can talk for several hours on any of these subjects, but I don't want to bore you to death. So are there questions at this point? Go ahead.
What is the difference in energy density between oil product and alcohol product?
Okay, yeah, that's an excellent question. I love that. So what energy density refers to is the number of BTUs, the number of like heat units you can get out of a given weight quantity of any fuel. And if you take gasoline, the number of BTUs per gallon, and a gallon weighs around 7 pounds, is about 120,000 BTUs, right? And for alcohol, for ethanol specifically, we're going to get specific here now, for ethanol, that same energy density is about 85,000 BTUs. So the amount of heat you get out of that gallon or out of that pound of fuel is about 2/3 of what it is out of gasoline. Now, what's interesting about that is that a lot of the gasoline guys have made a big deal out of that. Pay attention to is this. The amount of heat generated out of a pound of fuel has nothing to do with its ability to propel a vehicle down the road. In other words, there is a thing called the mechanical efficiency of a fuel. And what happens in gasoline, and I'm going to get a little technical on you here, sorry, is that when the engine, the way the engine operates is a piston goes up to top dead center, and then there's an explosion that happens that pushes it back down, and that's what propels the vehicle down the road. And in gasoline, because of its very low octane compared to ethanol, that explosion happens in a very, very short period of time, so that most of the energy is expended while that piston is at top dead center, which is also when the crankshaft is at a position where it can't utilize that energy very much. By the time it's coming down here, where it really can, which is the 90-degree place where most of that leverage would be, the explosion is already mostly gone. Ethanol, on the other hand, has a very high octane rating, which means, by the way, that the flame travel is much slower. So it starts exploding a little bit before top dead center, and it keeps pushing all the way down when it has the most mechanical advantage in that engine. What that means is that the same gallon of ethanol in a properly designed engine, and that's really important, can actually give you better gas mileage than the same gallon of gasoline. And most people they say, I'm completely full of shit, that can't happen because of the energy density situation. Well, it's not true. It can indeed happen if the engine is properly designed for that. What is a properly designed ethanol engine? It's one that has a high compression ratio. So a converted diesel is actually one of the best engines for that. And it needs to have a high compression rate and a long stroke travel. So because that takes full advantage of that. One other interesting thing is that ethanol is one of the few fuels that you can mix with water and still use it in an engine. So you can we've actually done work where we put up to 50% ethanol, 50% water in an engine, and we preheated it and put it in the engine, and it still actually propelled that engine. And what we called it was our internal combustion steam engine. And what it did was, the ethanol actually did light up and explode, and it vaporized a whole bunch of water into steam, so you actually got that benefit too. So you could actually get the same gas mileage from a 50% alcohol, 50% water fuel as you could from gasoline. Now that's pretty amazing, because just think about it. That means you have to convert that much less biomass to ethanol to get those results. But the engine has to be completely retrofitted to do that. I wouldn't put that in any engine. It would have to be a retrofitted engine. Are there any other questions? Yes?
Does the 10% ethanol that's in the gas pumps now, does that help boost mileage when it's mixed with gasoline?
Well, okay, that's a good question. The answer for that is... Oh, sorry. Yeah, I need to do that. The question is, does the 10% ethanol that's in gasoline now boost the gas mileage? And the answer to that is actually not necessarily. It will do it in some engines, and it won't do it in others. Specifically this. The 10% ethanol actually raises the octane of the gasoline ethanol mixture. If you put 10% ethanol in an 87 octane gasoline, it ends up being around 90. Now, what's interesting about that is that most engines these days are designed for low octane gasoline. They're designed that you actually put in an 87 octane, and they do best on that. When you put a 90 octane gasoline in there, it might not even get the same gas. It might get a little bit less, might be 5% less, but it should get around the same gas mileage. Now, if you put it into a high compression engine, you get better gas mileage because the octane is higher. So it varies from the engine to engine. Can you repeat the question?
I say, based on what you just said.
Yes.
If the gasoline companies change their marketing around to the point that there should be lower octane gas and adding the alcohol to up to 87 or whatever.
Yes, that is indeed happening. So the question is, have the gasoline companies figured out that they can ship a lower octane material because ethanol is being blended with it, and therefore the octane will be raised at site, basically? And the answer is yes, they have done that, yes. And you had another question?
You gave an example of an internal combustion engine as retrofit. What about Stirling cycle or some other technology?
Well, exactly. There are actually many different types of energy-producing devices, and one of the ones that you just mentioned is a thing called the Stirling engine. And specifically, what a Stirling engine is it's an engine that works on. It has a piston that operates and rotates a crankshaft, so it's a little bit like a regular engine. But this one actually operates, it gets its motive power out of the temperature differential between one end of the cylinder and the other. So basically, you have one end of the cylinder that's cool, and then you can heat the other end of the cylinder up by any means to get a Stirling engine to operate. One of the best models for that is now being sold as a combination Stirling engine generator set. That's, in fact, I think the only commercial availability of this engine. And what they do is they actually have what do you call it? It's a solar concentrator. You know, what is that called? The parabolic solar concentrator, where it takes sunlight in and then it focuses it on one point, and it points it right at the end of the Stirling engine that needs to be heated. And that then creates motive energy that operates a generator, and it's a very efficient system. Any other questions?
The exhaust of the burning the two fuels,
Yes.
petroleum versus like the wood chip fuel,
yes.
exhaust, the waste product.
Yes.
Differences?
Much better. The biofuels are much lower in a lot of the noxious things that gasoline emits, and that's in fact the first big effort that we made on a national basis to get ethanol into the fuel mix was around besides being independent of foreign crude and all that, was around clean air. And we actually got the Clean Air Act to include, as you know, I guess a little bit of education might be useful. There are many areas of this country which are referred to by the EPA as non-attainment areas. And non-attainment areas mean that there's so much pollution that they don't meet certain EPA standards. And so those cities and those areas are under obligation to implement strategies to reduce the pollution in their areas. Some of the strategies they can implement are getting people to drive every other day or something, to start carpooling and so on. There are various strategies, but one of the strategies is to bring in ethanol, mix it with the fuel stream in order to reduce tailpipe emissions. Yeah. Yes.
Do you agree that biomass is carbon neutral? And if it's carbon neutral, if you're harvesting the CO2 after the fact, converting it, say, via algae, you're carbon negative?
Yes, exactly. No, so the question is biomass carbon neutral? And so part of the question was, if you use the CO2 that's released when you burn biomass, because it is released, of course, can you use that CO2 then, if you use it to grow more biomass, does that then make it a carbon negative situation? And the answer for that is absolutely yes. In fact, a renewable energy economy, if you're using all the modalities available, is basically carbon negative. Because what you're going to be doing is, remember this, the carbon dioxide that is emitted from a tailpipe of an engine or whatever place you're burning it from a biofuel is less than was taken by the plant to grow that biofuel in the first place. So you're reversing the carbon problem that we are having by using biomass fuels. Yes?
Where does hydrogen come into the picture?
Ah, that's a really good question. Well, so here's the thing. My problem with hydrogen is that in most cases, the people that want to make it available want to make it from primarily hydrocarbon sources. And the system itself needs to be very sophisticated in order for us to use hydrogen as a fuel in our automobiles or wherever. I mean, it's a highly sophisticated system. And so only really powerhouses, big corporations can get involved in creating it in the quantity and then the distribution system to basically make it available for automobiles and so on. Now, so on the mass scale, and especially for internal combustion engines and so on, I say no, stick with the simpler stuff. Stick with methane, which is compressed natural gas, or made from biomass, or stick with ethanol or you can make hydrocarbons from biomass, but biomass-derived fuels, there are many that are much simpler, especially, and what we look for especially is liquid fuels. In other words, the system is currently set up for liquid fuels. Liquid fuels have a much higher energy density than gaseous fuels, and so that's the best way for fuels that go into a vehicle or into something that travels. The best energy system for that is one that creates liquid fuels, and you can make lots of different kinds of liquid fuels from biomass. On the other hand, if you're using an energy source on a stationary basis, that is, whether it's your cooking stove in your kitchen or it's a generator that sits in one place and operates, then you can use gaseous fuels because you don't have to go through an enormous compression and so on to make it into a liquid or to compress it. You can use it pretty much at the pressures that it's being generated at. So it's a really good idea that if you're using methane from a methane digester or hydrogen, you can make hydrogen from biomass also, you see. I mean, as you know, you can do it through electrolysis from solar. You can also make it by, for instance, you can ferment certain kinds of biomass using blue-green algae, and it produces hydrogen as a byproduct. So that's another way to produce hydrogen. That gas you can use on a stationary basis, and it's a great gas to use because it's the least polluting of all gases. Any other questions? Yeah, Jim.
I'm curious about how do these biofuels work, say, for instance, in the Wankel engine, the rotary engine
Okay.
that was becoming popular back
Yeah, so the question is, how do biofuels work in a rotary lobe engine, like the Wankel engine? I think Mazda was using it and so on. And just real quickly for everybody else's sake, what that is, in most combustion engines that we have out there in vehicles, we have pistons that move up and down, and they rotate a crankshaft in order to create the rotary motion that then moves you down the road. And the Wankel engine was actually a pretty good idea. What they did was they created a cylinder, and then they put a lobed device, a lobed piston inside of that, which just turns. And the way that it's designed is that it actually compresses the gas in part of its cycle. Then there's the gasoline, the explosion, and then it pushes the lobe around. So it's the idea being that instead of having an up and down, which is a jerky motion where you're changing direction of metal and creating inertia and dealing with all kinds of things like that, you can develop this very smooth rotary effect. And the answer is that biofuels do just as well in those engines as they do in the piston engines. The only thing is to take maximum advantage, you would want to design them to have higher compression ratios than they currently do.
Grayson station, point in Hillsville, the marathon distributor. 2 years ago, they made a big splash about selling biofuel, biodiesel. And I suspect you might have been involved in some of that. I noticed that advertising, especially with their new place over there, that advertising has totally disappeared. Do you have any evidence that distributors are putting the pressure on retailers to not sell bioproducts?
Okay, so the question is, and I'll just shorten it, is there any evidence that there's pressure from the majors on the retailers to not sell bio-derived fuels? The answer is no. That pressure has pretty much disappeared because there's been so much pressure on them to start accepting it. So the fact that we now see a percentage of ethanol in most of the fuel stream in the United States is evidence to the fact that they have now accepted it. And just so you understand, I was involved in the biofuels movement in the 80s, where we had to go to Congress every other day to fight some anti-ethanol propaganda and various mechanisms they were instituting to try and prevent biofuels from getting into the stream. They finally quit. Did you have a question?
I just had one comment to partially answer this question.
Yeah.
I spoke to the owner of that Marathon store a couple of weeks ago, and the reason the biodiesel that he was selling at that station, he was getting from the distributor Redbird Energy in Martinsville, Guyville, and he is a canola farmer that is manufacturing biodiesel from that canola. And the reason that he's not selling it is because it's not price competitive now. People at this point won't buy it unless it's cheaper than conventional diesel.
Yeah.
And so he's quit carrying it, at least for now, because of the fact that conventional diesel is at the same price.
Yeah, just to address that a little bit, and just the explanation was because that he's not selling biodiesel anymore because the guy that was making it on an individual basis did not find it cost competitive with hydrocarbon diesel. And the situation there has to do a lot with scale. One of the things that we looked at for a long time and have continued to look at is what is the appropriate scale for a biofuels plant? And in most cases, it's not a good idea for one person to try and take on converting corn or whatever it is to alcohol or creating biodiesel, because it takes care and attention to do that. In other words, it'll occupy all of your time and only end up with a little bit of fuel. And the question is, if you charge anything for your time and you have to pay for the crop that goes into it, or you look at the comparative value, it just doesn't make sense. What we recommend is community scale systems where one ethanol plant could deal with all the needs of Grayson County, for instance, and that the farmers participate in ways that they bring crops to that plant, those crops get converted, the farmer gets back any fertilizer or food value that he wants out of it, fertilizer or food value, feed value, because there's a high value feed produced as a byproduct, and then that fuel be available either to him or to the community. And if that system is set up, then we'll have a surplus that can go into the community. My prediction is that we can easily supply all the fuel needed for any community from about a 20 to 30 mile area. And I'm talking about, towns and villages. I'm not talking about cities, of course.
With all the money that Big Oil has put into research for algae oils, what's your take on that?
Well, algae oil is, I think, something that will become part of the system overall. And the reason for that is because I don't think we'll get away from the fact that there will be lots of people living in areas that can't and not involved in the system, in the cycle, to be able to produce their own fuels. So you will always have a need for fairly massive amounts of fuels. And if you want to derive them from biosources, one very good option is algae. And the reason for that is this. What I was talking about in the beginning of the talk was the fact that we have a lot of organic waste. It comes from our human population, it comes from our animal population. I mean, if you look at any feedlot or if you look at any swine operation, whatever, there's a huge amount of organic waste that is available and, in fact, causes all kinds of pollution problems. All that waste can be turned into biomass. One really good way to do it is through duckweed, through algae, and so on. So the main thing there is that you would put it into a water system that is a controlled water system, and then you put in the species that you want to grow. They grow like nuts. I mean, you could even have it near a biofuels plant. And biofuels plants, when you're fermenting ethanol, you generate a huge amount of carbon dioxide. You can bubble that carbon dioxide in and get it to grow at an even more rapid rate and get much more biomass out of it, and then harvest that and turn it back into fuel. That is a very good system, but it's going to require about another 5 years to develop, just because there's a lot of things that are needing to be.
That's your main purpose is to grow algae. So if you had a symbiotic relationship where you allowed growth of algae, say via a photobioreactor, and did that as a
Well, okay, so, and I wish I'd brought some of my props. The question here is around, well, he's talking about the fact that you could be growing algae as a standalone, or you could do it as a part of a system where you're basically taking advantage of things like carbon dioxide produced from fermentation. You're taking advantage of liquid wastes and bio wastes from some kind of an operation that creates those. My input there is that it's always best to have it be part of a symbiotic system. That is to say, and I have some really nice diagrams, and anybody who wants that kind of stuff needs to get my business card, and then I'll email it to you. But basically, we have a diagram where we show a crop being grown over here. That crop is then fed to livestock and the dairy cows in this case. The dairy cows produce milk, of course, which is then sold to the community. The manure from the dairy cows is put into a methane digester. Methane is produced. The methane from the methane digester actually takes, oh, I'm sorry, there's a part missing that I forgot. The corn first goes through an ethanol plant. The ethanol is of course sold to the community as fuel. The byproduct feed from that, which is a very, very high value feed, is fed to the dairy cow. The dairy cow produces milk, which is sold. The manure goes into a methane digester. The heat from the gas from the methane digester is used to power the ethanol plant. And then the effluent from the methane digester is used to grow the corn. That's a complete biosystem that has outputs from it. And the interesting thing is that that system can not only sustain itself, but thrive, all right? Because everything in the system actually increases with every time it goes through the system. And people don't understand that. And that's what symbiosis is about, that each species actually makes the next part better, makes it easier and better for the next part in the system, for the next species and so on. So you end up gaining over time from that system. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I still have a few minutes. Yes?
Well, that's another question.
Go ahead.
So far, you've been talking about portable fuels. What about non-agricultural but mechanical applications that would require heat or electricity or something of that nature? You mentioned wind and solar when you first started off.
Yes.
I don't see those as a viable replacement for what we're using a lot of carbon fuel for. And of course, Carroll County just rejected anything that looks like a wind farm. Were you aware of that or not? Happened to speak to the council.
No, I did not know that. Mhm.
Where does biofuel fit into the need for, say, mechanical or electrical generation?
Well, my input there is that I think biofuel is the way to do it. Now, the question becomes which method? And my input again there is that the least amount of processing you have to do, the best is better. So for instance, if you had a system that needed just heat or even compressed steam, for instance, as its main power source, then rather than going through all the conniptions of turning something into a gas or a liquid, there are plenty of available systems which can very efficiently take wood chips, for instance, sawdust, for instance, and convert it into high-pressure steam. So there's a principle that I want to just talk about, which is that, generally speaking, you want to try and use the simplest form of energy for the application that it works in, and only get into the really complicated technologies, which are the gas and liquid producing technologies, for that where it is needed, and that would be for transportation fuel. In stationary appliances, you can get away with all kinds of other mechanisms that are much bulkier and so on, that wouldn't work in a transportation system, but would work very well to create power on a very localized basis. Does that answer it? Okay. So, are we all questioned out? Okay, one more.
Hasn't Brazil been very successful at converting to ethanol, except they use sugarcane?
That's indeed true.
Heavily tax that as an import.
Okay, so two questions. Has Brazil created a very successful biofuels and, well, ethanol program? And yes, they use, and do they use sugarcane? Yes, of course they do. And the last part of the question was?
Don't we tax that about 50% for imports?
You mean the fuel from Brazil?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I'll answer them one at a time. Yeah, Brazil actually has been a leader in creating an ethanol program. They learned a lot along the way. Initially, they had a two-fuel system, which we also, in this country, by the way, We've had an ethanol program for fuel several times in the last 100 years. The first one was in like 1908, 1909, 1910, 11. Your original Model T and Model A Fords could adjust from pure gasoline to pure ethanol with under-dash adjustments. I mean, and you could pull up to a pump in the Midwest. There'd be two pumps, one of them called benzyl and one of them called ethyl. And the ethyl one had pure ethanol in it, and the benzyl had gasoline. That was in the early 1900s. Then we had another program like that in the 30s, and then again, of course, in the 80s, and now again in the 2010 and so on. But to answer your question, Brazil in the 80s created a program where they were becoming almost completely independent of foreign crude. And they did it through an ethanol program. Yes, sugarcane was the crop they did. You know, you could grow 2,000 gallons per acre and so on, you know, because it's a very high producing crop in a tropical area. Of course, they grew it chemically, which wasn't a good idea. But the fact is that they did indeed kind of lead the way in showing that you could do that. You could go on to a purely renewable economy. Initially, they actually did the same thing as we did in the Midwest, which was have gasoline here and ethanol here. And the problem there was that they only created cars that would do either or. And so every now and then there'd be a snafu in the delivery of one or the other, and half the vehicles in Brazil would stop because there was no fuel available. This happened both on the ethanol side and on the gasoline side. And in this country, they got a little smarter about that, and they basically have created vehicles which are called flex fuels, which go from pure gasoline to pure ethanol or any mixture in between. So you can buy a flex fuel vehicle and you go to an E85 pump, which has 85% ethanol in it, 15% gasoline, and fill it up and run the tank halfway down, and then go to a gasoline pump and fill it up with gasoline, and you'll be fine. The engine does all the adjustment through oxygen monitors and so on. So that was, now Brazil is finally smart enough to do that. And then, as you probably know, they just discovered vast oil resources offshore. And now they're going back to a completely hydrocarbon economy. What can you do? Yes?
Okay, can I be the one to ask the wacky question?
Please.
About zero-point energy?
Yes?
Do you think that it's real, viable? And also, I have read about a physicist by the name of Bernard Hayes who has a patent on zero-point energy, the first one to issue. So, what do you know about that?
I know nothing about zero-point energy. It's one area I haven't looked at. What is it about? Can you tell me?
Well, not really, except that it's based on the Casimir effect and that they're pulling electrons right out of the air by creating these tubes which are so thin that the electrons can be captured, the energy from the electrons.
You know, it's,
I'm not a scientist.
yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot about various tubes and ways to capture electrons and energy that way. And what I keep, whenever I run into someone that talks to me about that, I said, can you please show me a working model? I'm one of those people that, you know, I've heard so much about so many different energy producing devices and energy creating devices that I'm a show me guy. You show me and I can actually check and see every facet of what's going on. I'll believe it if it's doing it. And I haven't ever run into one of those, so sorry to say.
I don't think they make use that way either.
No, they don't, that's for sure. And the thing about it is this, again, just to reiterate, there is plenty of solar and biomass energy available to do everything we need to do several times over if we're intelligent about it. We need to learn how to use nature's ways of creating the energy resources that we need, the biospecies that we need to help us do what we're doing, which is to live and to thrive. And we can do it. Thank you, everybody.